A few weeks ago, we heard a story of despair and a story of the loss of hope. We heard a story of a man who was beaten and crucified while his closest companions, his followers, his disciples, all but abandoned him. They denied that they knew him. They were nowhere to be seen when he died. But somehow these same people who had made themselves very scarce were suddenly boldly making their way to the ends of the earth to proclaim a message of salvation, to share the good news, to tell the world that the man who was beaten and nailed to a tree had risen from the dead. And not only had he risen, that he indeed was in our very midst. So what happened to these people? Well, we really can't explain it except to say that they had an experience of the risen Jesus that changed their lives in a way that they themselves could not explain. They had an experience of the risen Jesus that made them give everything else up and go wherever they were needed to tell people about that same experience. In other words, they had an experience of the risen Jesus that compelled them to share it with the world. But the experience of the risen Lord was not limited to those who had known him before he died, because it was an experience of the risen Lord that changed the life of a Pharisee named Saul. Saul had never met Jesus, although he was persecuting his followers. Saul was convinced that he was doing that which God wanted him to do, until he was told otherwise. Saul came face to face with the risen Jesus, and the encounter changed his whole life. Saul became Paul. The persecutor became the champion of the persecuted. Paul's zeal and single-minded way in which he went about proclaiming the resurrection of the Lord could only have been the result of one thing: a complete and total conversion based on an experience that moved his heart and told him that this indeed was God's will. And so Paul went on his missionary journeys and took the good news all over Asia Minor, all the way to Rome. Paul and his various companions, here we hear about Barnabas, but he went with Timothy, he went with Sosthenes. They took the good news to the Gentiles, to those other than the chosen people, because they had been told, because they had experienced that God's offer of salvation was being extended to all of God's children. And no matter what kind of opposition Paul faced, he never gave up. That kind of determination can only come from a life-changing encounter with the risen Lord. It is the same risen Lord who today confirms the ongoing relationship that we have with him. My sheep hear my voice. I know them. They follow me. I give them eternal life. They shall never perish. And no one can take them out of my hand. I know them, and no one can take them out of my hand. It is the same promise of protection, of intimacy, of salvation that the risen Lord offered to the disciples and then to Paul. I know them. Just as God told the great prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah, I have known you from your mother's womb. But we're not just talking knowledge here, we're talking of an ongoing relationship of love, a relationship that is constantly offered to all of us, a relationship that points to salvation. And this is important to remember, I think especially in these days. Sometimes I think the world seems to have gone mad, because every time I hear that there's another school or church or synagogue shooting, I wonder when we as a society are finally going to do something about it. For the last almost 20 years, for those of you who can remember, the new normal has been to live with the threat of ongoing terror and the reality of war in the Middle East and Africa, and maybe even with North Korea. When peace sometimes seems to be an illusion that is always slipping away, where strife and ancient hatreds continue to divide those who profess to be doing God's will, it sometimes seems as if the experience of the risen Jesus is becoming more and more irrelevant. What does Jesus have to say, given all these things that we are facing in the modern world? Is the message of Jesus, or more importantly, the person of Jesus, still significant? While there is still much hostility to the Christian message, what worries me more is those who simply disregard the question of faith. People who profess to be spiritual but not religious. People for whom questions of God and questions of faith are all but ignored. It is almost the opposite of what Paul encountered. In a society that's been nominally Christian for 2,000 years, sometimes we forget how radical, how countercultural, how politically demanding the message of the gospel is. Sometimes we think it is enough to try to be a good person and to live a life where you don't bother other people. But Christianity is at its root evangelical, and by that I mean that it calls for, it begs to be shared by our preaching, by our actions, by our standing up for what is just and right, by saying no to violence and poverty, by really caring for our neighbors and not just watching them on the news or passing them by on the street. Because Easter compels us, as it did the first disciples. Easter compels us to share our experience of the Jesus who animates our life, the Jesus who fills us with joy, the Jesus who loved us into being. That's what Easter did for the early Christians. And so we continue on with this. And it is precisely in our struggle to continue to find God in the midst of all this craziness that we will find the promise that changed the lives of countless people for 20 centuries. My sheep hear my voice. I know them, and they know me. I give them eternal life, and they shall never perish. No one can take them out of my hand. Jesus' words are eventually words of hope, and the promise that in the end, experience and the power of the resurrection is greater than anything we will ever know. And that, dear brothers and sisters, is good news. That's good news indeed.